Ah, loro vedono anche la presentazione, cioè non la vedono attraverso lo schermo, cioè si può condividere lo schermo così la vedono direttamente. Perfetto. Ok. Poi c'è anche questo.
¿Empezamos? ¿O hay otros que tienen que llegar?
Ah, Leonardo, io so they, them pronouns. Uso pronomi they, them. They, them, pronomi. Quando parli di me.
Ah, they, ok.
Ok, sì.
Grazie. Hello everyone, for our today's talk. I'm very happy to introduce Riccardo Cuciniello. They are PhD students at the University of Genova. They did a master thesis on the University of Torino on extended synthesis with Elena Casetta. Now they're doing a PhD thesis at the University of Genova and also Torino. It's a consortium. And moving to biological teleology, so very interesting topic for the group, also extended synthesis, and also it's quite interesting how these two dimensions intersect in their work. And so I'm very happy to leave you the stage, and thank you very much.
All right. How much I'm talking. I'm really grateful for everyone who's taken the time to come all the way here to listen to me, so I feel in depth. So I hope to give you something back. So my research is about natural teleology, and what I've been really fascinated with is the concept of plasticity. And I think there are good reasons to connect these two ideas. And I will try to convince you that what I'm doing, I'm not wasting my time trying to connect these two things. And also, I will try to also convince you that the organizational framework is the good place to start to kind of connect these really important dimensions. These are the main three parts of the talk. I will also give you an introduction before this, in which I will make my case that this is a possibly important work, and also why it matters kind of in the contemporary zeitgeist, which connects the philosophy of biology and evolutionary biology. And then the three parts, the first one, I identify two souls or tendencies which are coexistent within the organizational framework. One sees existence as being the main goal of organisms, another one sees conditions of existence as being the goals in the plural sense. So I call them the one goal view and the many goals view. Of course, there is a tension between them, but they're not in contradiction. And I will make the case that one represents the metaphysical stance of the organizational framework, is like kind of the organizational interpretation of the organism's strive to existence, and the other one is the way this is modeled in a more scientific context. In the second part, I will show you how I think this connects with the issue of change and how change can be interpreted following either one of the two views. I will try to show that the first way of understanding teleology is more connected with the idea of adaptivity, and the second one not so much, or it does it in a non-trivial way. And in the third part, which is kind of the more wild and explorative part of this research, I will talk more about the connections between teleology and plasticity by focusing especially on the idea of regulation, which we know is so important for the organizational framework, and especially the account of natural teleology. And in the end, I will give my very modest and very wild proposal that exploration and exploratory processes are interesting, but I'm very open to change my mind about it. So I'm kind of assuming that you're all more or less familiar with the basics of the organizational framework, so I will not present them, but I want to emphasize how the organizational account to teleology is so different from other accounts, and it's a good thing. It's very different from teleonomy and the etiological approaches, which take a very Darwinian stance on purposiveness, but is also very different from field theory insofar as it is non-neutral in regard to goals. So goals also have a normative dimensions and are defined in relation to organism benefit. But also it's very different from behavioral approaches, or rather Dennis Walsh approach, insofar as it doesn't just use teleology to explain or over-explain certain phenomena, but it tries also to explain in causal terms what teleology is, with the notion of closure of constraints, and therefore also provide a naturalization of teleology too. Within today's climate, we could say, I feel like there is a convergence between what the philosophical approach to teleology and what evolutionary biology has been saying in regard to organisms taken as self-determining beings or self-constructive beings. For example, we have the idea that organisms are both cause and effect of themselves, which is a very Kantian phrasing, and that we also find in more evo-devo or extended synthesis literature. For example, in like their papers, the more introductory papers on the extended synthesis, Lalande and co-authors say that organisms are both causes and effects of evolution, but evolution is also seen in an organism-centered way, so they are cause and effects of themselves. We find the idea of self-determination in the idea of development as something which is self-constructive, in which inheritances, which can be genetic and extragenetic, acquire a meaning only within the organism, self-constructive and self-determining development. And also maybe the more teleological aspect of it is the idea that organismal ontogenesis adaptively biases evolution. Now, there is this paper titled Teleology in Evo-devo by Dennis Walsh, in which he says, like he does very sweeping statements. He takes all concepts from Evo-devo like plasticity, robustness, novelty, and he says that they are all expressions of organismal purposiveness. And I think like Dennis Walsh theory does not really have the instruments to say something like that. I think the organizational framework does have the causal methods and tools to do something like that, but also to problematize this idea. Maybe, yes, plasticity, however we interpret it, might be an effect of teleology, but it might also be, or teleology might also depend on plasticity, or maybe be derivative from it. And I will try also to show that there are some parallels between teleology and plasticity, especially in relation to how invariance and variability are understood. So now, the first part, by reading the literature, especially the one on teleology, but kind of all the literature in the organizational framework, I think we find two strands of expressions on the way purposiveness is described. Sometimes I just put some quotes, but there are many more examples like this. In the first case, we find the telos, or the goal of organisms, to be existence, also understood as self-maintenance or maintaining viability. For example, we read that in the case of biological systems, their goal and their own existence are one and the same thing. In another paper on the role of regulation in teleology, Leonardo writes that variation is produced in the pursuit of self-maintenance, the telos of the system. So self-maintenance is the goal of the system. In his last book, he says that the telos of the system is understood in terms of self-maintenance. And in a paper about kind of the organizational account of development, they write that the telos of the system is grounded in the maintenance of the viability of the organism at each stage of development. So here we find the first characterization of organizational teleology. The goal is to exist, but not to exist as like an inert thing. To exist is also to have a certain activity. To exist is to do something. And this activity is self-maintenance. But at the same time, this activity is also conditional on producing certain properties or certain conditions which characterizes the organism's viability. So maintaining certain properties which are compatible with life. In the other strand, instead, we find a slightly different characterization of the final causes, or the goal, in the plural, the goals of the organisms, as the conditions of existence, which I think it's not really the same thing as the existence. For example, we read something like the conditions of existence on which the organization exerts a causal influence can be interpreted as the goal of biological organization, or the conditions of existence of a biological system, its telos, so it's plural, are established having goals, again it's plural, by the system itself to the operation of the components that realizes. And there are so many quotes like this. Now, what are these conditions of existence? They are basically the constraints of a closure of constraints of biological organizations and the relation between these constraints. Now, I think this word conditions is really interesting, and it has kind of a double meaning. It's both descriptive and normative. It is descriptive in kind of the same way as when you go to your friend's place and you see the state of their kitchen and you say, oh, this is the conditions you're living in. So it's the way you are living, but interpreted in more organic way. So the way my body is right now is my condition of existence. But also the way my body is right now and the way my organization is also the reason why I am existing. So it's also a cause of my own existence. And we can ask whether these are conditions of existence in the present state or in any state. And this distinction is quite important. Just to give you some example of how these two views of teleology interpret variations or different cases. This is, I think, is kind of an crustacean, Daphnia cucullata, who develops these little structures here when it's developing in an environment with predators. And we can either say that, for example, that helmet or that crest, they are means to achieve the same goal, existence, if we take a one-goal view. Alternatively, we can say that these variations are the final causes of the organization as it is. So we are referring to the same organization, but we are interpreting its goal-directedness in slightly different ways. Or, for example, another case, we can say that these different shapes that the leaves take in different contexts, like submerging water or outside, can be three different means to achieve the same thing in different contexts, or can just be three different kinds of final causes, because they play different roles in the organization. Now, why is it why I call this the one-goal view metaphysical? I mean it metaphysical in a vaguely Kantian way. Now, you might know that Kant's critique of metaphysics is also related to his critique of the ontological proof for the existence of God, and his argument is in very, very simple terms that if you think really hard about the concept of God, you cannot prove the existence of God just by understanding existence as a property of God in such a way that you cannot think a non-existent God as being contradictory. So what Kant is saying, that existence is not a real property, is not something that we can add to a concept that would add more to a concept which does not have existence as a property. And we can transpose it to to this topic. We can say that the existence of an organism, well, it's not a part, it's not a property, but of course it's dependent on the parts and the properties and the activities and the relations between them. However, to characterize it as the goal of an organism is to identify something which we cannot directly, empirically find in the organism itself. So it's not a real property. There was published a paper a couple of years ago by Luca Corti in which he problematizes the very idea of existence in the organizational account. I cannot go into it, but he makes the case that there is an ambiguity about whether existence is to be understood as generation or maintenance or even conceivability. And he also asks, what is the thing whose goal is existence? Is it the individual constraints? Clearly not, because teleology is a dimension of the whole organism. But we can ask whether existence is the goal of the whole organism in its present form, so we take the existence of a certain regime of self-maintenance, or is the existence of the whole organism in any possible form, so even in its changeability. And instead here we focus on the more adaptive character of the organism, which can change different forms of self-maintenance. Instead, the many-goal view, I take it as the modeling of this metaphysical stance, the way we try to represent in more scientific terms the organisms strive to existence. Now, this is like the very generic and abstract description of a closure of constraints. And for example, we have C3 as being the efficient cause of C2, and C2 is the final cause of C3 because they exist in a circular and self-maintaining causal network. And this allows the organizational framework to approach even real-life cases and possibly model goal-directed behavior. Now, what I would propose here is that in this attempt to explain scientifically teleology and goal-directedness, conditions of existence are a kind of proxy for existence itself, which what I mean is that to describe the way the organism tries to achieve existence at its goals, we can only understand it as trying to maintain certain empirically definable conditions, because existence is not a property, it's not an empirical phenomenon in and of itself. And we can also ask in this case, well, what are these conditions? Are they the actual present conditions, or are even all the possible conditions, so conditions that change? So not just this set of conditions of existence, but also others. And I think this has to do with the way we understand change. So, in the one-goal view, we can take changes to be instrumental to self-maintenance. So change itself, moving from O to O prime, so to one organization to the other, as being in itself teleological. And in this case, teleology is interpreted as having the characters of robustness. That is to say, it is persistent and pleonastic. It is persistent because there is one goal which is achieved constantly through time, but it's also pleonastic in the sense that the same goal can be achieved in many different ways. And because of this, there is a focus in this strand of interpretation on adaptivity. Now, in this case, I would say that if the present conditions of existence of an organization are a proxy for existence, they can be taken as somehow informing the organism on what it has to do to keep on existing in whatever form. So they're not the same thing, but the organism uses them somehow to inform its own state and keep on existing in a robust way. In the many goals view instead, we have goals themselves, the conditions of existence, as varying through time. So what is changing is not the means to achieve this one goal, but the goals themselves, which are understood plurally. Because of this, change is to be understood as more open-ended and non-predetermined by the teleology of the system. And here you see the face of Lacan, because I was thinking about Lacan's phrase that there is no meta-language. And what he says basically is that there is no higher language which makes all the other languages clear and self-evident and obvious. And in the same way, I would say that there is no meta-teleology. So if there are changes, we cannot appeal to a higher level of teleology to justify them. And this is where I think we should look for plasticity. Another way of interpreting this is to say that the present conditions of existence underdetermine change. And the question that therefore I ask is, can we think of self-determination, or the way, like what is usually understood for teleology, beyond goal-directedness, beyond robustness, so persistency and pleonasm? Can we think changes in teleology rather than just teleological changes? Also, this is something that I thought about a couple of nights ago, and I just included it because I think also thinking about the way this might relate to selection is important for the study of plasticity. I would not go a lot into this, but I just want to say that there is kind of a circularity in teleology in much the same way as we can see a circularity in the more traditional understanding of adaptation. So the circle of adaptation says that a variation is adaptive, or rather is an adaptation because it has been selected, and we can take selection as being both external, classic natural selection, but also internal, physiological selection. But at the same time, we can also say that a variation is selected because it is adaptive, so it benefits the organism. Of course, this is not true. Sometimes selection does not select for adaptive things, but it's a logical argument. And the same circularity, we can find it in this understanding of teleology. So E means conditions of existence. We can either take conditions of existence and their changes to contribute to existence because they are means to achieve a goal. So we are in the one goal view focusing on adaptivity, or we can take conditions of existence as being goals, so having the value of goal or rather characterizing the goal directedness of the system because they contribute to existence. So they assume a teleological value because of the causal system they are in. I am really thirsty. And here I'm moving. How much time do I have? I'm going very fast. I'm not used to this, if it wasn't clear. So, plasticity. I am reading this book. I'm still reading it, but almost finished. And I'm using it as the main basis. It was published in last December, so like it's really recent. And it's quite important because the author, Antonin Nicoglou, I think that's how you pronounce it, she goes on this kind of historical and epistemological journey across the notion of plasticity and the word plasticity and plastic terms. And she shows that there are some countless interpretations across different fields. There is a tension between all these interpretations, and these are just some of the few more epistemologically minded interpretations. We can take plasticity as explaining developmental variation, but also as being explained by natural selection. And in these two cases, we can also further interpret plasticity as being more genetically determined. So I think Massimo Pigliucci tried the hypothesis there are some genes for plasticity as distinguished from the genes for the trait, which is supposed to be plastic. But we can also take a more developmental and organism-centered view of plasticity itself, and perhaps also take it, therefore, as a developmental bias on evolution by being a bias on variation. And the author basically ends up saying that plasticity is somewhat of a boundary concept. So it signals a tension or something unresolved and kind of unknown in biology and across biological fields. For example, the case of the way Darwin uses plastic terms is quite clear. He speaks of plasticity and uses plastic terms when he's trying to propose possible explanations of variation, but of course at the time they did not have like developmental biology in such a way that could explain variation. They did not have genetics. So he's talking about variation to say that they don't know how variation happens. Now, a very generic description of variation could be that it's the organism's capacity to produce variation in response to environmental inputs, which is such a generic description which really adds nothing, but at least it's a working definition that you can hold in your mind while I'm doing this. I want to focus especially now on plasticity taken as an explanance of variation, since I'm interested in changes of teleology, and also because it is in this context that we find a lot of similarities between, a lot of connections at least, between plasticity and goal-directedness. As an explanance of variation, Nicoglou confronts it with the ideas of induction and regulation, and especially regulation is extremely important for us because it's kind of at the center of the organizational account of teleology. Induction is, in the context of induction, you think of the induction cascade that guide cell differentiation. Plasticity is kind of reduced to the ability or the capacity of a cell to be differentiated by the signaling by other inductive cells or inductive processes in a time hierarchical way. So in the context of induction, plasticity has a very diminished role. But also induction only explains very selected cases of variation. When it comes to regulation, things start to become more interesting. I will not go into the organizational understanding of regulation, mainly because I want to present other ideas and other views on regulation, but also because they resonate a lot with the way regulation is understood in the organizational framework. And for example, here Nicoglou quotes Kang Wilhelm, which there is this beautiful quote which I'm going to read. So the concept of regulation involves at least three ideas: that of the interacting relationship between unstable elements, and in this case we can think of the inherent instability of an organization, a regime of self-maintenance which cannot just self-maintain as it is. It needs to be regulated in order to become stable. That of a criterion or a benchmark, so something which is an invariant and it's a norm, and we find in the organizational literature references to things such as second-order norms or metanormativity, which would give an interpretation of this idea of benchmark. And that of the comparator, so something which compares the present state of the organism with this benchmark. So regulation, in this case, is the adjustment in relation to a few rules of norms of a plurality of movements or acts and their effects or products, which their diversity or succession renders initially alien. And you can read this phrase in a kind of organizationally minded way. Nicoglou goes through different ways regulation is understood or has been understood in biology. The first one is the idea of regulation as emerging from the interaction between the organism and the environment. It's an idea that goes back to Auguste Comte, and then it has been more developed by Piaget, which is extremely important for the organizational framework, as he was the person who came up with the duality of thermodynamic openness and organizational closure. And in this context, self-regulation becomes self-regulation, which maintains closure, and in particular emerges from the accommodating relationship between the organism and the environment. So the organism accommodates certain environmental inputs so as to maintain the closure. And this idea was then inherited by West Eberhard, who proposed the concept of phenotypic accommodation, which I like to describe as the organism bearing the mark of the environment. So the organism restructures itself around the modifications that the environment has induced. The problem with seeing regulation as emerging from interaction is that there are so many levels of organization, and the interaction with the environment does not happen at all levels. So another way of understanding regulation would be regulation driven by a benchmark of some kind. Oh, by the way, all of these is ways of understanding how regulation explains variation. And it is in this context that we see regulation as a function which regulates other functions and is proposed to maintain an invariant norm, for example, homeostasis in the case of Claude Bernard. And it is in this context that the references to plasticity become very scarce, as Nicoglou points out. But there are also cases, more recent, of seeing regulation without a benchmark, which are more interesting. One case is that of phenotypic plasticity, in the case in which one genotype can express different phenotypes according to an environment, and it's not clear why, what is the benchmark that determines that a butterfly should develop one color instead of another. But there is a way of reintroducing a benchmark here, which is through the evolutionary notion of norm of reaction. But another case, again, is that of niche construction, which really Nicoglou takes as being extremely disruptive for the idea of benchmark from the idea of an invariance, because the locus of regulation, again, the interaction between the organism and the environment, is a place where nothing is stable. Like the organism changes as the environment changes the organism, and the organism changes the environment. The relation between the two is constantly changing, so we cannot refer to any stable normative invariance. And especially in the context of niche construction, plasticity is a constitutive aspect. Just to be very honest, there has been an attempt of reintroducing benchmark and even teleology in the concept of niche construction in this paper by Abbey and Desmond, which is, I think it's titled like Niche Construction and Teleology. And they describe niche construction as being goal-directed in those cases in which we have a reduction of the chaos and the indeterminacy of the environment. For example, when you build a nest, you make your environment more stable. And even in this case, we see that teleology in niche construction again refers to robustness, to maintaining some kind of invariance. So what is kind of clear is that as soon as any reference to a benchmark or as a stable state disappears, in order to describe a mechanism that would be at the origin of variation, the notion of plasticity seems to be preferred to that of regulation. And I think this quote is really important because what it's saying is that variation, as soon as, like as a benchmark, the idea of an invariance, of a meta goal disappears, the origin of variation cannot be understood as being functional to that goal. So it's not changing means to achieve the same goal, but we start to talk about plasticity. And regulation, at least understood in the adaptive sense, loses its explanatory power. So it would seem, here I'm going so fast. It would seem that there are some variations which can be explained teleologically or by reference to a benchmark with regulation, and there are others which seem to exceed regulation and thus seem to exceed teleology. So there might be some kind of extra teleological variations, and I think one candidate for this kind of extra teleological change would be novelty. But it's not so easy. I found this paper which has a really fascinating title, which is When the End Modifies Its Means by Armin Moczeck, which is one of the most important scientists working on the extended synthesis. And the paper is about the evolution of novelties and the evolution of evolvability. And what he is saying, and it's so fascinating to me that he adopts such a teleological language, is that innovation, so new variations which cannot be reduced to previous benchmarks, still happen because and not in spite of conservation, first. The second thing is that the relationship between robustness and plasticity or invariance and variability is not so stark. So there is a blurring between robust and canalized development and plastic context-responsive development. And towards the end of the paper, he says that development and developmental evolution can thus both be viewed as dynamic processes that modify in their own means. So even in the context of studying novelties, it seems that we fall back into the one-goal view, so the reference to some kind of meta-teleology or an invariance, a benchmark of some kind. So the possible space of plasticity as not being reducible to teleology seems to shrink a little bit. And the idea would be that teleology is plastic because it modifies its means. And my modest proposal is that of exploration. And I think exploration, especially, I'm being inspired by the theories of facilitated variation and heritable physiological exploration. It allows me to carve, again, a space for plasticity without also being too, how can I say it, too one-sided. And I will explain what I mean. What do I mean by exploration and what is its context? So especially Poschwil and Danchin, I don't know how to pronounce their names, I'm sorry. They propose a scheme to explain the plasticity and the production of novelties and very fast evolution. First, we have exploration, so in which there is a blind production of variations. And what's important about exploration is that variations are produced by downregulating, or breaking certain constraints. So there is a lack of what we could say robustness dynamics. So there is a suspension of teleology, at least locally. So there is variation is underdetermined by the current regulatory profile of the system, and also it has nothing to do with the fitness values that it might have. But also we have stabilization after a certain point, and here I think when teleology is coming back, because just to go back to this, there is a circularity between variation and selection, and stabilization can also be called selection. So there is exploration, then a certain profile is maintained, selected. What they say is that even though the cells, for example, they don't, or the organism does not know what state is going to select, or what is the most stable or most adaptive state, when it reaches, it at least knows that it has reached that state. And then we have transmission, so a certain variation is transmitted or at least accommodated in the rest of the organization. And by having a momentary suspension of teleology and then a change in the organization which accommodates for this, we might have a kind of teleology which is plastic because it is in itself modifiable in a way which is not predetermined by the intrinsic adaptivity of the system. Of course, this is, I'm rambling here. I don't know where this might take me. I think it's interesting also because it might connect the organizational framework with internal selected effects theory, which has been recently focusing on the idea of internal selection as producing functions and goals. So, to sum up everything, there are two souls in the organizational framework. One interprets organisms as having one goal, which is existence, and the other one interprets organisms as having many goals, their conditions of existence. And this leads to two distinct interpretations of the relationship between teleology and change. So we either change the means or we change the goals. So either change is teleological or teleology changes. And this also reflects different possible explanation of variation. So regulation explains some variation, and maybe plasticity can be used to explain others. And we can maybe imagine plasticity as a complement to teleology, something which does not replace it, but should work with it without being completely reducible to it. And maybe it allows us to think self-determination beyond the idea of an invariance, of a benchmark, therefore robustness. And exploration might maybe emphasize the open-endedness of change, but also the susceptibility to stabilization. So finding new teleological profile without them being predetermined. And so goals themselves would be plastic. Thank you so much. I'm so fast. I'm so sorry for talking so fast.